We're starting very prompt at 9:31, so thank you very much. If it's all right with you, we will go straight into questions. Are you happy with that?
Of course, absolutely.
Right, okay, fine. Now, the first question is, the bill represents a major transfer of powers from the EU to the government, and largely bypassing Parliament in many respects. There are also extensive powers for the Secretary of State in the bill, but not very many duties, dare I say it. So could you explain why exactly you're taking this particular approach?
Yes. Well, the first thing to say is that, as you quite rightly point out, we're taking powers away from the European Union. And one of the things about the Common Agricultural Policy is that many of the decisions that have governed British agriculture over the course of the last 40 years have been taken at a level where we may have been able to influence, but ultimately Parliament had to accept whatever it is that the Executive concluded when it was negotiating in the EU Council or anywhere else. So, as well as a transfer of powers from the European Union back to the UK government, and in particular also to the devolved administrations, it is the case that Parliament will have a greater degree of scrutiny, both, of course, as the bill passes, and as any secondary legislation that is consequent on the bill is passed as well. And one of the arguments that I know has sometimes been made during the passage of Brexit-related legislation is that Parliament sometimes feels that it should have more of a say, a perfectly understandable point of view, but Parliament will have more of a say than it had while we were in the European Union, and I think that's sometimes overlooked. I think that people sometimes compare a perfect model, as they might see it, of parliamentary accountability, and decline to note the way in which, for many years, while we've been in the European Union, there have been aspects, not just of agriculture, but of huge swathes of policy area, where ministers and indeed Parliament have had to meekly accept that which was decided elsewhere.
On the fact of where you, in many parts of the bill, it says the government may, or the Secretary of State may. There's very much the Secretary of State shall or will. Why is it not sort of more definite? Why doesn't it have a more definite approach? You've allowed yourself a great deal of flexibility, dare I say it, Secretary of State. And I'm just wondering, just being a naturally suspicious person, why that is. Does George, you want to come in?
Yes. Well, look, this was actually discussed at length yesterday during the committee stage of the bill. Yeah. And this idea that you should have must instead of may, the Secretary of State may do things, is, I think, a misreading of how our Constitution, how bills have traditionally been drafted in this country. So if you look at the 1947 Agriculture Act, it is riddled with the term ministers may. It even says ministers may, where they consider it expedient to do so, bring forth measures to do X, Y, and Z. So the 1947 bill itself was drafted in very much a framework way, just as the current bill is. It's also the case that as recently as 2006, the NERC Act, that also had powers to make payments, and the term the Secretary of State may is what was used. So it's just the correct way to go about these things is to establish powers for government to be able to do things. How you then exercise those powers and how you commit yourself to do that, it becomes a matter for manifestos, for budgets, for argument in the House of Commons. And as the Secretary of State says, we will have way, way more parliamentary engagement in these developments of these schemes than we do at the moment. At the moment, the best that Parliament can expect is an explanatory memorandum informing them, if they have the will to read it, what latest things the European Commission have decided to do.
So you're giving us the assurance that if you're going to we're going to come up with a much smarter, better stewardship schemes where we can include trees, we don't have to work out whether they're saplings or trees. You've promised that, and I think we can make a real progress there. Are you promising us that we shall be able to look at that? You won't just present us with a scheme and say, there you are. Like it or lump it, basically.
Look, we're going to be developing these schemes and developing pilots over the next couple of years, and once we get into that, I'm absolutely certain that this committee will want to bring either me or the Secretary of State or whoever else might be in our place at that time to come and give an account for what they're doing and why.
Going back to you, Secretary of State, I think that the interesting thing now is that it would be totally different from the last sort of 40 years under the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy. rightly or wrongly, there was a payment that carried on, and it largely could be changed, but it took a long time to change, and it had to be agreed by 27 countries. It's very cumbersome, but the only benefit to it, it did roll on. The issue now is that there's enough powers in this bill just to be able to cut everything off at the knees if a Secretary of State chose to do so. And I think that is, is it, I suppose to a degree, how much can you make it bulletproof for future Secretaries of States and future governments? So probably the answer is you can't. But to what degree can we bind future governments in this bill?
Well, all governments are subject, of course, to democratic accountability and to the capacity of the House of Commons to vote supply and to scrutinise any schemes that they bring forward. The interesting question about the Common Agricultural Policy itself is that it, at the moment, is in the process of review. Commissioner Hogan is looking at what the future might be. We cannot guarantee, no one can guarantee what future decisions the European Union might take about what shape the Common Agricultural Policy might have in the future. One thing that this Parliament can do is it can ensure that ministers, not just in DEFRA but also in Treasury, continue to support the countryside and continue to support food production in an appropriate fashion.
Where I suspect we will pass the bill, and I'll talk to you a little bit later on about how much you would. Perhaps very quickly, I'll throw in. How amenable are you going to be to amending the bill? We will look at all amendments on their merits, and we recognise that there are a number of points of concern and areas where people want to make changes. I think it's the case, and I'll defer, of course, to George, who's been taking the bill through committee, that, for example, on the red meat levy, an amendment has been put forward, I think, by Colin Clark and Chris Davis, which I think it's our intention to look favourably on. Yes, and then on more the sort of emphasising a little bit more on production and on food production of good quality food. Is there going to be? Would you be amenable to anything along those lines?
Yes, I think that again, Philip Dunn has talked about ways in which we can find language in order to provide reassurance on that front. Of course, one of the things that we want to look at, as with all amendments, is just to make sure that it does what it says on the tin and that it provides the appropriate either reassurance or clarification.
Because I think one of the points I've always made, and I know I'm repeating myself, but is that there is a really big link between, especially in grassland areas, between those sheep, cattle and cows that graze those hillsides and pasture land in order to create the great environment we have. And if we don't have enough of them, we won't be able to keep that landscape like it is. And I think that's something, and I don't know whether you share my concerns on that.
I absolutely share your analysis, yes, and thanks to your generosity. And thanks to the work I've done in this job and beforehand, I've a deep appreciation of the vital importance of making sure that working farmers, not least in the uplands, are provided with the support that they need in order to not just generate the food that we enjoy, but also to ensure that the public goods that they produce as well are adequately rewarded. But
they are very much linked. Do you see that?
I absolutely appreciate the link, and it is the case that 70% of this country is farmed, and some of our most beautiful and iconic landscapes, and also some of our most important habitats depend on the active work of farmers, whose principal aim, of course, is to secure a fair price in the market for the food they produce.
Can I add, we also discussed this yesterday, and so systems like pasture-based livestock systems, so you actually actively support grazing livestock, because as you said, that can have a positive impact both on the animal welfare, but also on public health and also on the farm environment. Those are exactly the sorts of schemes that we have under consideration.
Thank you, Joe. Angela, you wanted to make a supplementary?
Thank you, Chair. I'm surprised at the analogy made with the NERCAT. I was on the committee for the NERCAT. It was an enabling bill, but it was nothing like this bill in the sense that the NERC bill brought together different government agencies. It did not extend the powers available to the Secretary of State and Henry VIII powers in the way that this bill does. So I think that's not a correct parallel to make.
Just clarify, so this was a specific reference to a section of the bill that created the power to make payments, used the term the Secretary of State
one
may.
part of the bill
One part.
To make powers.
That
the
was
overall bill did not have the extent of the enabling powers that this bill has.
That's right, because the overall bill wasn't about payments. So this bill is predominantly around schemes, payment schemes that must be funded, and the traditional way that's been drafted through all of our domestic bills going back down the decades.
All right, let's just go back to NERC. I mean, I remember the debate we had about the definition of animal sentience in the bill. We're nowhere near having a definition of animal sentience as it stands now. So the level of detail in the NERC Act was much greater than what we're seeing in this bill. And I'm just asking you to accept, perhaps, that this bill does extend significant powers to the Secretary of State in a way that is a departure from the usual pattern of legislation making that we have in the UK Parliament.
Well, I think it's consistent with what we do when it comes to payment powers to pay, which is predominantly where that term is used, and it's similar to what, as I said, was used in the 1947 Act. So the NERC Act was a very different act. So the reference that I made
was a very different act.
A very different act, and that's because it had very different purposes, and much narrower purposes in some ways. It was about agencies and the rest of it. This is a bill that's achieving something different, but where it relates to how you do payments, the wiring is the same.
All right, so let me just go. You said something earlier, George. You said that the powers in the bill will be subject to budgets, which is interesting, manifestos, which seems to suggest that the electorate will be offered options, potentially, on what the payment system may look like at the next general election. Is that true? Is that how you see it?
Yes. So we've already set out, through our paper, the approach that we're taking with environmental land management contracts. We've outlined that we're going to start those pilots now. So we've outlined as a government a very clear approach of how we intend to move forward an environmental land management scheme. But obviously, if the Labour Party or others at a general election had a different view about how that should be constructed, it would be open to them to outline that in their manifesto and seek a mandate.
How do you think that the NFU and other concerned bodies may react to that, given that all they're asking for is certainty?
Well,
it's all up in the air. We're going to throw it to the electorates at the next election. That's not very satisfactory for all those farmers out there who are wondering whether they're going to get any money post-2022.
Well, at the moment, if they were still in the European Union, there would be doubt as to whether or not they would receive money after 2020, because we don't have any clarity about what the Common Agricultural Policy will be.
Can we just refer to the point about 2022 general election? Is that satisfactory?
Well, the point I'm making is that you have to ask the question, is it satisfactory that European farmers don't know what they're going to have after 2020?
Yeah, but they know they'll get cap if they're still in the
But they don't know what cap is going to be.
And
there's one other point.
It's a nonsensical argument.
No, it's not a nonsensical argument. It's an inconvenient argument for the line of argument that you want to run, Angela, but it's not nonsensical. There's another point as well. You say that this bill is a constitutional novelty. Absolutely not the case. When Tony Blair introduced legislation, for example, in order to fund academies, he gave the Secretary of State for Education at that time the power to enter into an arrangement with any person who the Secretary of State thought fit for the provision of state education. That was a significant power, one I believe that you voted for.
Within very clearly defined parameters, I have to say. I go back to the point.
There are clearly defined parameters in this bill.
Common agricultural
but the powers given to the Secretary of State for Education at that time were significantly greater and more flexible than the powers given to the Secretary of State here. And you were happy to vote for that legislation?
I wasn't in Parliament at the time Tony Blair introduced the Academies Act. Right. But I go back to the point, the Common Agricultural Policy has evolved over many years. This is a significant departure.
Yes.
It's the biggest change in agricultural practice in 70 years, potentially, or at least 40 years. And both of you are saying that it's going to be thrown to the electorate at the next election.
Well, no, I think the other thing is, as George pointed out, that the approach that we're taking is the one that was also taken by the Attlee government when it introduced the Agricultural Act in 1947.
It's not 1947 Secretary of State, it's 2018.
No, but your
slightly
argument...
different now.
It is indeed, but your argument is that this is a constitutional novelty, and as George pointed out, in fact, it's entirely consistent.
No, my argument now is when
you changed your argument.
No, I was asking you about certainty for farmers.
Yes, well, the other thing is, Angela, can you give certainty to anyone over public expenditure? Who knows what Jeremy Corbyn might want to do to our defence budget were he to be elected. That's one of the things about democracy.
I'd sooner not, Secretary of State, I'd sooner not.
But the thing is that your argument is that yes, essentially, George puts it better than I can.
At the moment, the only certainty farmers have got in the EU is they'll get what they're given by the EU. That's the only certainty. No. What they have is, with the restoration of self-government in this area for the first time in half a century, is a certainty that elected parties, responding to their needs, their lobbying, the views of the electorate, will be able to deliver.
I remember the consultations that were engaged in 2014 in relation to Pillar 1, Pillar 2 and the shape of the CAP scheme then and the reforms to the CAP scheme, so I don't think that's a fair comment. But can I just refer to another point, just finally?
Please, I want to get on if I can.
Another point you made, that there will be arguments in the House of Commons. But there won't, will there? There will only be potentially statutory instruments. That's not really satisfactory, is it, in terms of implementing the powers in this bill? The only scrutiny enjoyed by the Commons will be in SI committees.
In some cases,
the phrase arguments in the House of Commons suggests big debates on the floor of the House. That's not going to happen, is it?
Well, it's certainly open to the House to decide that any aspect of this could be debated at any time and in any way. That's a democratic principle.
That's a debate. But in terms of the agreeing the delegated legislation that will flow from this, that will not be on the floor of the House, it will be generally in committees. And we know all the shortcomings that system presents.
Two things. Well, it will be open to the House to have delegated legislation debated on the floor of the House. I've seen that happen in the past. The other thing that I would say is that the powers that the House will have will be greater than they currently have at the moment inside the European Union, as the Minister of State pointed out. And as I know from my own experience on the European Scrutiny Committee, we're presented with fait accompli, take it or leave it, on the basis of decisions that have been taken by qualified majority voting in the Council of Ministers.
Can I just say, Chair,
So, sorry, Angela, but when your statutory instruments, you are not able to amend them. They're unamendable.
Exactly.
That's the problem we've got with it, you see. So a lot of this stuff will be reduced to us as a fait accompli, and I suppose, technically speaking, you could vote them down, but you're unlikely to in reality.
Well, you could vote them down, of course, but you can't with European Union law.
Right.
So yes. that is undoubtedly a democratic
I think, Angela, I don't want to carry on the argument about this because we've got a lot to get through. So just one final point on my question is that, when I talked about shall and may, may is not binding. Aren't there any sections where the government and a future should be bound by this bill, putting should in? So I know you've given yourself maximum flexibility, but isn't there parts of it, with stewardship schemes, with long-term management of land, isn't there something that should be just a little bit clearer on we should do it or I shall do it?
You could say that the government must, for example, pay into any given scheme. But what if a future government were to say, well, we will pay, but we'll only pay £1?
Yeah, but also, I think, don't you also believe, though, with stewardship schemes, and we'll probably talk about long-term management more in a minute, so I don't want to take all those questions, but it's a case of surely there's got to be some sort of contractual arrangement where the government is bound, and that makes it more difficult because you're not going to build up your soil qualities. You're not going to hold water on your land. You're not going to do all these environmental management, plant trees, and do all these things. It's not going to be done in 5 minutes, is it? 5 to 10 years in farming is short term. I know it's long term in politics, but it is in farming matters and land management matters. So don't you see there's a sort of necessity for that?
Well, I think you make a very good point about contracts. I think one of the things is that the environmental land management schemes that we conceive of, in many cases, will be contracts, and contracts entered into which can be, of course, if they were abrogated, then there would be legal remedies for those who had signed those contracts. There's another point as well, which is that the agricultural bill is important, but it's not the only piece of legislation or the only document that will bind government. So the 25-year environment plan sets out a proposition whereby there will be targets and metrics to which government will be held to account, and also the environment bill, when we bring it in, will also have other, I hesitate to say fetters, but protections in some of the areas that you quite rightly mentioned.
Right, okay. I just wonder whether there shouldn't be just a little bit more protection, perhaps, in the agricultural bill. Now, question number 2, Kerry, please.
Okay, question about trade deals. You've said repeatedly, and I accept your assurances, that there will be no lowering of British standards post-Brexit. Can you give the same assurance that we will not sign up to any trade deals that would allow produce into this country that is produced to lower standards than we allow? So has the International Trade Secretary said the same?
Yes, he has.
So anything, and does that apply to standards that we would currently apply by virtue of our membership of the EU?
Yes.
Right. Okay. That's the first time I think I've heard that, because the suggestion seems to be no lowering of British standards, and there would be concern about hormone pump beef, the native chicken, so none of that. What about GM?
Well, there's an interesting question there. At the moment, there are strong protections on genetic modification. However, one of the interesting questions I find is that the recent European Court judgment saying that gene editing counts as a form of GM has been challenged by a number of scientific voices in this country. So I, at the moment, have an open mind about what gene editing might be able to provide in the future. But I've no... So that's I'll be explicit about that area, but we've no intention of changing the rules that govern what we understand by existing GM methods.
Right, but to go back to the first question, anything that is currently banned from import into the UK, subject to the GM thing, I sort of accept it's changing science, so there might be a sort of movable feast in that respect. But anything that's currently banned would not be allowed in under trade deals.
Yes.
How will that work in terms of you get into a trade deal situation and there's a fear that, and we've had the US Commerce Secretary, we've had people in Australia, New Zealand, all basically saying that they're not going to accept this, that they are going to argue for a change in British approach. So how is that going to work when people actually get into negotiating room? Because it won't really be you, will it? It will be the international.
I think any trade deal would have to be agreed not just by the cabinet but by Parliament as well. The commitment that I've underlined today is one that the International Trade Secretary and indeed the cabinet have agreed as well.
But we tried when the trade bill was going through to ask for greater parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals. There was some sort of row about whether the bill whether it didn't cover future trade deals. That's what was trying to be said, so we couldn't discuss how we look at them. But would you... so what's your view as to how the scrutiny of trade deals should work in Parliament? There's some suggestion there should be a committee with rapporteurs appointed to each trade agreement, whatever. I think that's how it works in the European Parliament, actually. Yes. Is that... would that be an approach?
I think I wouldn't want to trespass on the International Trade Secretary and the Treasury's view on these matters too much, but I think you've got to have effective parliamentary scrutiny. Yes, absolutely. I don't know, George, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I mean, I think it is that one is a matter for the DIT, but I know they've already made clear, for instance, that any treaty obviously comes back and has to be, if not ratified, it's presented to the House, and then there is a power of the House to actually veto any treaty even under our existing arrangements, under the CRAG Act, Constitutional Reform Act. And so there are some provisions there, but look, it's an area that I know the Department for International Trade are looking at. The other thing I would say on this particular point, though, is GM trade obviously already comes into the EU, so it is the case already that something like 70% of all animal feeds are GM. So the EU has very tough restrictions on the cultivation of GM crops, but it's very open to trading in GM products. And so that it's less of an issue when it comes to trade because it's already accepted by the EU anyway. The other thing is, if you look at the trade deals we've tried to do with the US, so we're trying to get access for British beef to the US. They've made requests that we adopt their particular methodology for testing for E. coli. We don't agree that it's better, but if that's what they request, that's what we'd be willing to accept. They've asked that we adopt the way that they score and check whether animals are lame when they arrive at a abattoir. We have a slightly different methodology in this country, but again, if that is a requirement that they want to place on suppliers supplying the US with beef, we'd be willing to do that. So the general principle in trade deals is that you respect the customs and rules of the country where you seek to do business.
But in terms of leverage, if we want to, it's financial services being traded off against beef, and that potentially means that something has to be bargained away. That's the concern. But I've seen figures that suggest that when the Secretary of State gave evidence before, when we were talking about, I think, chlorinated chicken and so on, you said that it wasn't a food safety issue, it's perfectly safe, it was an animal welfare issue. But I've seen figures from a number of organisations that say that whereas in Britain, well, one figure I've seen is 1 in 66 people a year, another one said 1 in 70 succumb to food poisoning. In the States, it's about 1 in 6. Why do you think that is, if there's not a food safety problem with their food production?
Well, I wasn't aware of that statistic, and I
think Which came up with the 1 in 66 and 1 in 6 figure. I think Sustain have come up with the other figure.
I would, without wanting to push back against those statistics, the one thing I'd want to do and will do is to look at them to see what the, if they are identified sources of food poisoning in the United States might be, whether it is, for example, from chicken or from other sources, just in order to understand it. But my understanding was that the reason why you had washing in chlorine or in other chemicals was that there was a risk as a result of having chickens in essence kept in circumstances where their welfare was compromised, and they were kept in circumstances where the amount of space that each individual bird had was less than we would allow in the United Kingdom. That increased the risk of infection, and that increased risk of infection was then dealt with through chlorine washing. So it starts out as an animal welfare issue, but of course it has human health implications. Chlorine washing resolves the question of food safety for anyone consuming the chicken, but it obviously doesn't tackle the problem at source.
It sounds like if the food poisoning rates were as high as I've been told, it sounds like it might not solve.
Oh, it definitely merits investigation, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay,
There's a very different culture. So we have a what's termed a farm-to-fork approach, where you try to minimise disease and infection at every stage of the production. So from the farm, where you don't have, we try to limit stocking densities and try to have good husbandry and support that through regulation, right through to the abattoir. The US approach is much more turn a blind eye to what might happen on farm and then treat it when it gets to the abattoir. So it is a cultural, it's a different culture, and they don't have a culture of putting animal welfare in a particularly prominent position either when it comes to their production systems.
My final question is, if I put forward an amendment in the Bill Committee, yet another amendment. I feel very sorry for the Minister, because he's had to put up with an awful lot of me in the last
grateful that you withdrew some.
Been given very good responses, actually. But if I was to put an amendment to the bill that sought to ensure that any food production standards imposed domestically would apply equally to imports, would you be happy to endorse that?
Well, our view is that that's out of scope for the agriculture bill. It's the kind of thing, it's a legitimate argument to have in the context of the trade bill. And I know those arguments, I think, are going on as we speak in the other place, and indeed amendments were put down to the current trade bill, along those lines. So it's an issue around trade and the types of trade negotiations you do, rather than the types of domestic support schemes we might have for.
But it is also a real issue of concern to farmers. It's not just about standards, about prices and a race to the bottom. And a lot of farmers are very concerned that all the protection, all the subsidies, so it does very much link, all the subsidies we give to British farmers would be pretty meaningless if they can be undercut by lower quality, cheap imports, where they cut corners in the way you've described.
Yes.
So I think it is relevant to the bill.
We do understand it's an incredibly important issue for farmers, but nevertheless we think it's outside of the scope of this particular bill, which is all about what types of schemes we put in place to replace the Common Agricultural Policy.
We'll have that argument in Bill Committee. So.
Secretary of State, Minister, when Sonny Perdue came here, from the United States Secretary of State for Agriculture, he talked really nothing but about getting access to our market for their chicken. That was virtually every time we had a conversation, he turned it back to that. And so therefore this is really real in any future trade deal with America. So that's why, you say it shouldn't go on in the agriculture bill, food standards, but you want to create higher food standards here. And so therefore, and welfare standards, and we support that, but you have got to protect us against imports. And so that's why I don't see what harm it would do in the agriculture bill, because then at least when a trade deal comes along, at least when we're debating it here in the House of Commons, we can say in the agriculture bill it refers to maintaining those standards when we import food. So why are you, both of you, so adamant that it can't go in the agriculture bill?
Well, I think I will sort of answer why I think it's out of scope. But on poultry, look, bear in mind we import at the moment around 750,000 tonnes of poultry from Thailand every year, and we put requirements on it. We have veterinary requirements that it fits our standards. And so my argument would be if Thailand can get their act together and put themselves in an adequate position to be able to supply the UK market...
Yeah, but you're not answering my question. I asked you what harm would it do to put that in the bill. I don't see why you are so... And I think the Secretary State also, I'd like an answer from you, please, as well. I mean, why is it that you're so adamant it can't go there when your whole raison d'etre of British agriculture in the future is to have higher welfare standards, environmental standards, which we all very much welcome, but if you're going to do that, there's got to be some protection, and I see no protection because we couldn't get it in the trade bill, and so now you say it can't go in the agricultural bill. Then we can debate it on the floor of the House. Well, how long will we have? And how much are we going to be able to alter a whole trade bill on this one aspect? So we need some armour. And I'm not saying this armour would protect us totally, but it would help us. This is the point. Secretary of State, where are you on this one?
Well, as the Minister of State pointed out, it's not in scope in a bill which is intended to deal with future payments and also with fairness within the supply chain here. But the sentiments that you've expressed are ones that we both absolutely share. I should just say, and indeed the whole cabinet does, I should just say that when I talked to Sonny Perdue myself, one of the points that he was at pains to make, following on from a point that Kerry made, is that from America's point of view, they understand an animal welfare case. This is not a reflection on the government or anyone here. They feel, from their point of view, that the assertion that their chicken is not safe to eat is one that they find difficult to accept.
Yeah.
So part of it is amor propria, or as George pointed out, a proper appreciation of the different approaches that those countries take. But of course, should Kerry or anyone else want to put forward an amendment, we will look at it, but we fear that it might be out of scope for this legislation.
And just finally on this, just not only on animal welfare, but on food safety and on antibiotics. You've got a case where I believe, we have been very successful in reducing our amount of antibiotics. Now, whether I'm correct with these figures, but there are figures saying that the Americans use up to 4 or 5 times as much antibiotics with their production of chicken. So isn't that another good reason why we don't particularly need that type of production? Because I think, George, you spelled out they take many more risks basically through their production. They're more intensive, and then they whack it with chlorine at the end to make sure it's safe to eat. I don't think any of us can argue for a moment it's not safe to eat. It's just that if we want to reduce antibiotics within our feedstuffs and within our rearing of our livestock and poultry, in order that we have greater immunity hopefully in the human population, do we not? So this would just be the totally wrong direction to go in. So that's why we're so keen to get this in the bill.
Well, on antibiotics, you're right. The poultry industry in the UK have made substantial steps forward. I think it's something like a 60% reduction in use of antibiotics over the last 4 years. And they've done that by changes and adaptations to their husbandry, looking more closely at their policy around thinning, for instance. And so it's an area where we've got a huge amount of expertise, and it's a very innovative sector in the UK, and they've done well. So I would imagine that.
Yeah, they've done well because they've got a certain amount of protection at the moment. And you see, the trouble is what they won't be able to do as well, will they? If they've suddenly got to have a lot of it, they accept a lot of imports, which reduces the price.
One of the things that the Chief Medical Officer and others are doing is seeking on the international stage to secure commitments to reduce prophylactic antibiotic use as part of, as you quite rightly point out, need to deal with the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. And so, one of the things anyway is whether or not we were going to allow products into the UK market, we want to change behaviour in other countries as well. And Sally Davis has been doing great work on that, and we completely support that initiative.
Right. Alan, supplementary, and then I'll pass over to Caroline.
George, you'd mentioned that we currently impose standards on Thailand for chicken that's getting exported to the UK. Is that not imposed by the EU as part of the EU trade deal rather than the UK imposing these standards?
Some of it would be, but actually on well, it's common. So the EU, because trade is an EU competence, the EU would own some of this space. But even in addition to that, there are national rules and national agreements. So on a national level, when it comes to market access, a lot of it is country to country. So we're directly leading on our market access work, for instance, to the US and to Japan and others. And there will be elements of that agreement that would be directly between British veterinary authorities and Thailand.
Okay, I mean, I would still argue the EU is obviously a large trading bloc, carries much more weight when negotiating these trade deals. Is it not the case, if there's not a deal with the EU, so the EU trade deals don't roll over because there's no deal with the EU, and the talk of reverting to WTO rules, that immediately on WTO rules precludes the banning of the hormone-injected beef and the chlorinated chicken because it's actually deemed safe to eat. It's an animal welfare issue, and WTO rules won't preclude these coming into the market.
So take specific things such as hormones in beef or chlorine-washed chicken. Those are coming across through the EU Withdrawal Act as an SI, so they will become UK law. So it will, irrespective of whatever someone might say at a trade deal, there would be a ban on the sale of it in the UK because that would become retained EU law that then is put on a UK legal basis. The other thing is, in terms of the trade deals with third countries like Thailand, we've done a lot of work in order to make sure that those are rolled over. So this is UK to those countries to ensure that we're, as far as possible, particularly on the most important ones, we're able to roll those forward. And the poultry deal...
Can I just come back in there?
Yeah.
So surely if there's no deal with the EU, and all the talk was if there's no deal, we just trade in WTO rules. So therefore, does that not mean the current trading arrangements with the United States puts the UK back at square one and has to negotiate a trade deal with the United States? Because there's no rollover.
Yes, well, because there's no... But there are equivalency agreements on things like organics, where we've been doing a lot of work as part of our preparation for leaving the EU to bring those across and agree bilaterally with these countries that those would continue to carry on between the UK and those third countries. So that's been an element of our planning for leaving the EU under a deal or no deal that's been going on for at least a year.
So these equivalence agreements will carry on. The United States will say that's fine. We won't look to get chlorinated chicken.
In most cases, yes, because they benefit from those equivalency agreements as well. So if they were to scrap those agreements, it would actually create obstacles for areas where they want to do trade with the UK. So there's been quite a lot of work done. So and we're not there on all of them. Some of them have their own parliamentary procedures that they feel they have to go through, but a great deal of...
So the UK is taking back control, but relying on rollover and equivalence agreements are in place. Things will just carry on the same.
Well, as I said, we've done a lot of work to ensure that those third country deals are rolled over. And if you look at, say, the poultry deal with Thailand, most of that poultry comes to the UK because it's a legacy of UK investments in Thailand. So Hillsdown Holdings, which was a huge food conglomerate in the 1980s, had a very large investment in Thailand, and it's a legacy of that arrangement, and most of it comes here.
Okay. So nothing will change, but everything will change.
That's right. Okay, Caroline now, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to look at the trade issue from a slightly different angle, we've got the prospect of the EU rulebook, and so at the moment, as you've said, Secretary of State, one of the attractions is that instead of the rules being set by a council of ministers and qualified majority voting, in which we're only one state, they would be able to be set by the UK. But is that really true? If we had a rule book in which the EU decided, well, now you can't use glyphosate, or
you must only feed cows these feeds or whatever, would we be able to use glyphosate, for example, on crops that were for domestic or rest of world consumption, or to feed our cattle whatever we want, even if it's not in the rule book for domestic or rest of world consumption?
Well, the common rule book would only govern those rules necessary for checks at the border in order to ensure that we complied with the rules that the EU have for their internal market in order to ensure frictionless trade. We would have the choice as a country, were the EU to introduce a change such as that you mentioned, whether or not to accept or reject it. If we chose to reject it, then that would introduce additional friction at the border, and that would mean that we would have to consider whether or not we wanted to go down that route. So if, for the sake of argument, the EU decided to ban glyphosate and we wanted to continue to authorise its use here, then that would mean that the EU could introduce appropriate checks at the border should it wish to. But that would be a decision, obviously, for Parliament to take as to whether or not it required compliance with those EU rules in order to continue to have frictionless access, or whether or not we chose not to apply those EU rules and to accept the consequent friction.
And what level of consequent friction could that be? Would that be that some farmers are using glyphosate, so we won't accept anybody's crops, or we won't accept those crops that were grown in fields on which this?
Well, it would be for the EU to decide what restrictions it might want to place. It is theoretically possible, but it would be for the EU to decide that they might say UK farmers secure a competitive advantage by the use of glyphosate, which EU farmers do not have. Therefore, we would wish, potentially, to place these checks or restrictions at the border, or potentially to use, so I think that this would be a significant departure from what's conceived, a tariff as a way of redressing the balance. But I think that one of the things that the EU would also want to bear in mind is that at the moment, as we know, they export more to us than we export to them. And therefore, if they were thinking about any regulatory or other changes, they would also be thinking about what the impact of friction at the border might be on their capacity to export to our market as well. So you're absolutely right to pinpoint the fact that were the EU to change its rules, and we were not to keep in step with them because Parliament had decided not to, that there would be frictions, but the EU would also know that in the present, that were those frictions to apply, that there would be potential costs for their producers as well.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, in the Agriculture Bill, there is a whole load of things that you might provide financial assistance for, defined as public goods, but it doesn't explain which public goods might receive more money. So at the very introduction of this committee, our chairman said he wants to consider what practical implications this bill is going to have for the British farming sector. But is it possible for us, in reading this bill, to establish that, given that we know that people will be paid for public goods, but we don't know how much or in what proportion and which goods will be worth more than others?
That is a fair point. We can't know at this stage with absolute certainty, but one of the things that we propose to do, as George mentioned earlier, is pilot and bring forward schemes in collaboration with the sector in order to ensure that there is a proper understanding of what it is that the government can provide through public money in order to support farm businesses. And of course, as everyone here recognises, the principal business of farmers is food production, and one of the other parts of this bill is making sure that people get a fair price in the market by making sure that we have appropriate transparency in the supply chain as well. But you are right that we give the Secretary of State, me, any successor, the power to allocate funds for particular areas. We've said that we believe that environmental land management should get the lion's share of those funds, and so far that's been the view with with some qualifications of organisations like the NFU, the CLA, and others. But more detail will be provided.
So when will more detail be provided? Because, my husband's a farmer, I should declare that. There are also, I represent a large rural constituency. When I'm asked to vote for this bill, my constituents will quite reasonably ask me, is this bill in the interests of the people of Sleaford and North Wycombe? Is this bill in the interests of the farmers that work there? And how can I answer that question if I have no idea what they're going to be asked to do for the money? Because it may be that some of these 10 or so issues actually get tiny fractions of money. But each and every different, I mean, a suspicious person might say, because of the way it's drafted, everybody might think that they're going to get some money and it's going to be good for them. And it's only after the bill's gone through and you have the power that we will actually find out how it's going to be shared out.
Well, it's during the passage of the bill that we will be saying more about how the schemes might operate and the principles which we propose to deploy. But I quite understand why there's a desire for certainty and why there's a desire for people to have an opportunity to change, if necessary, their business model, which is why we've given a guarantee on a transition period, which means that actually there will be, starting from 2021, a long period of transition which allows people to make any necessary adjustment that they feel is appropriate. And I'm going to return to the earlier point. We know that the Common Agricultural Policy itself is changing and that Commissioner Hogan has been consulting on how it might change. So there is a parallel degree of uncertainty if you happen to be an Italian or a French farmer about what level of support you might get in the future and what you would need to do in order to secure it.
Okay. The other thing is you've talked a lot about quality and our farmers produce high quality food and how we could add value to those foods. That, I can see how that works in fruit and veg sector, how that works in the meat sector. But my constituency is full of cereal farmers. How do you add value to what is, you can't sell it at a farm shop, thousands of tons worth of what is a bulk commodity?
Well, I think that it is the case that cereal farmers operate on the basis of world commodity prices.
Yeah.
And we have, not least in Lincolnshire, some of the most productive, successful and efficient farms operating on an international market. So you are right to say that while there is an increasing demand for high quality food and an increasing demand for knowledge about how food is produced, that, as you quite rightly point out, growers, livestock farmers, dairy farmers and others can take advantage of. There are some other sectors where that is less the issue, but we are in a position where we're competitive, and one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that we invest in the technology necessary to ensure that we can be even more productive in the future. But I'll hand over to George, because he may want to say more.
It will vary. So the subsection 2 of Clause 1 gives quite wide powers to support productivity, and that can be investing in new equipment or in research and development, or in some sectors it could mean investing in things that might add value for the dairy farm that maybe wants to convert into making cheese, for instance. So it's quite a wide-ranging power, and its purpose is really to support the advancement of farm profitability in a range of different ways, and it will vary from sector to sector. But I mean, the arable sector would, with the schemes we've got under consideration, I think benefit from quite a lot under the environmental land management scheme, because if we had options around flower-rich field margins or grass lays as a break from arable crops as an option, or no-till or minimum-till systems, integrated pest management schemes. There are a range of things that we're looking at around farm husbandry that would be very applicable to the arable sector and which they'd be able to benefit from.
Yeah, and I can see how each and every different type of farmer and land manager in the UK can read the bill and see how there could be something in it for them if the Secretary of State chose to use their powers in a way that was beneficial to them. But equally, there could be nothing in it for them, and it could be much worse for them if the Secretary of State chose to use his powers in another way. And at the moment, we have no guidance on how that's going to be balanced. When will we get guidance on what these schemes are going to be and how proportionally they will be?
We set out a policy paper alongside the bill that gave some indications and talked about an environmental land management contract that you'd have with the farm. We've also talked about a departure from the current income foregone basis for pricing options and looking at something that's more market orientated and more along natural capital principles. So the principle is you might reward farmers more for the things they do for the environment. And the other thing you should bear in mind is until a few years ago we had around 70% of farmers in an ELS type of scheme, the entry-level scheme. And so the vast majority of farmers are used to doing some things of this nature. And that was designed in a way that was accessible to lots of farmers. And we envisage, while the new scheme will be better targeted and will intend to deliver more, we do envisage it will be accessible for a wide range of farmers.
Can we leave it there, because I'm very conscious of time. We're not making any progress much, but good questions. But can we leave it there? John, you want a supplementary, and then we've got to
just quickly.
on.
I think pilots are the way to go, but the public is obviously going to be putting in public money for public goods and so on. Have you thought about the regulation that will be needed? Will more resources be needed without making it overburdensome? You know, what are the implications for a very different system now of checking that public money is being delivered by the farmers who are getting the money?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at the moment is how farm inspection can be reformed, and Dame Glenys Stacey is looking at precisely that in order to make sure that we have a more robust but also less bureaucratic system of inspection. But you are right, there will need to be scrutiny. One of the problems at the moment, I think, is as George has outlined on a number of occasions, the current cross-compliance system, while designed to secure beneficial outcomes, is a needlessly bureaucratic system, and some of the requirements when it comes to mapping, for example, and some of the requirements that we impose because of the fear of the Commission imposing disallowance payments on us are more about checking processes than guaranteeing outcomes. And I think you're absolutely right that piloting can give us an opportunity to develop a more outcome-based approach towards rewarding people for what they do.
And I was encouraged by what you said about upland farmers, because do you recognise there's a danger with a move over to the public goods system that some farmers would argue that it's the sort of bigger farmers and landowners would be better if the system is too burdensome in terms of regulations. They will get a greater slice of the cake than they get now, and that has to be guarded against.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it is the case that, as we discussed at the second reading, that the current BPS system doesn't provide the support and reward that many smaller and upland farmers could legitimately expect to receive once we've changed towards a public money for public goods system. And we're very, very conscious of the environmental and other benefits that upland farmers provide and making sure they're properly rewarded.
And then just a final question from me. I'm slightly more sympathetic than some members of the committee to the promises that you've made in terms of finance going forward. I don't think they're unreasonable. The committee voted in an earlier report, we unanimously decided that we would like to ring fence the money that's currently going, not just for farming, actually, the phrase we used was rural economy and the environment.
Yes.
Is it possible that we can achieve these public goods for less than the 3 billion that we have at the moment? Obviously, that would free up money for other things. Is that possible?
It's possible, but it's not desirable in my view. I think that actually we get exceptional value for money from our farmers and those involved in the rural economy, considering the what we provide. I think there are other ways of making sure that we can get money from the private sector, water companies, for example, into the rural economy. But I think your broad point is the committee's broad point is a fair one. And I'd want to make sure that we've got the maximum amount of money and support properly targeted into farming and into the rural economy more broadly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, what I'm going to try and do is 5 minutes per question now. We'll see how we go. David, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Why haven't food production and security of supply been given more prominence within the bill? And second to that, should the bill contain some provision for the list of public goods to be reviewed and amended in the future?
Well, this has been very much the topic of debate, or one of the topics of debate in the committee, so I'll defer to George.
I think the first thing I say is I don't really agree that it hasn't got enough about food production. I know this has been a sort of a constant line, but it's the agriculture bill. The long title starts about making payments for agriculture. Clause 1 is undoubtedly predominantly about the cornerstone of the new policy, which is a policy of payment for environmental goods. But then every other clause in every other section is about food production, so improving transparency in the supply chain, powers to introduce mandatory contracts, intervention powers to stabilise agricultural markets. There's a very, very wide range of powers that are absolutely explicitly about supporting farmers.
Got that in clause 1. Why don't you actually start with all the things about agriculture, and then clause 1 is all about the environment further down? We're bound to be suspicious that in the bill, clause 1 talks nothing about very little about agriculture.
Well, the legal bit, but
George,
I think
I'm tempted to say that Hamlet is all about Hamlet, but he's not there in the first scene. You know, the bulk of it is, you know, and you know, anyway.
Well, it still needs to be turned upside down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Except, and that's only the case if you believe that that agriculture and the environment are things that we should divorce from one another, whereas we actually see them as being a much more holistic thing. It's two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. But the view, it's not only my view, and hopefully members of the committee, but it's the view of the National Farmers Union, the Ulster Farmers Union. They're all saying the same thing. There's not enough emphasis put on food production, and there is the cynics out there, which we know, that would say, well, the UK produces 60–65% of its food production. There's no encouragement in the bill for that to increase, and is the reason for that that the government is quite content to sit at that 60–65%, and was mentioned earlier, but when it comes to bilateral trade agreements, that it gives the government flexibility to allow a certain amount of product to come in, albeit under the conditions that the UK lay down, but it gives the government more flexibility. And farmers and even producers, processors need to have that confidence in investing. If they want to produce more, they can, and there'll be a return in profitability for doing that. So that is not only my thoughts, but it's the thoughts of a lot of farmers and a lot of processors.
No, I completely understand, David, and you articulate very clearly the views that lots of people have put forward. I think that there are different ways in which you can measure the health of the farming sector and the food production sector. So, of course, the degree to which we satisfy domestic demand is one, but also the degree to which we also grow by meeting the opportunities that new export markets provide is one. My view is that we want to have profitable farm businesses, that setting an abstract target for the amount of domestic demand that we meet would be a mistake, but encouraging more profitability and more productivity overall, consistent with good environmental outcomes, is absolutely what we want to do. And I'll just mention two specific areas, one of which I think I've touched on with this committee before. One is carcass balance. Northern Ireland plays a significant part in pig meat production across the United Kingdom. We know that there are certain cuts that are not favoured by the UK consumer, but which are favoured in particular in the Far East.
Yep.
If we can sell more to the Far East, that means that domestic demand for bacon and the cuts that are particularly favoured here can be met by domestic suppliers. So we can have import substitution at the same time as we have an export drive. Similarly, there's a challenge with sheep meat, because sheep meat consumption in the UK and in the EU is declining. If we manage to sell more sheep meat to the Middle East and to other Asian nations, then we can provide a more sustainable and profitable future for sheep farmers in the UK. So we're absolutely focused on that. And one other thing that the Chairman has been very hot on that we are going to say more about is a broader food strategy for the UK, which looks at how we can make sure that questions like food security and productivity and the promise of technology can be addressed in order to provide the farming sector with a healthy future.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that we get the balance right. George mentioned there briefly about the balance between the environment and food production. I think it has to be balanced, that it can't be slanted one way or the other. And farmers, producers, processors, whatever, have to have that encouragement to invest and have to see if there are opportunities. I accept what the Secretary of State has said, but I think if there are opportunities, then we need to show that those opportunities are there and the farmers can take advantage of it as well.
Absolutely, and one of the things again that we recognise is that across the United Kingdom, the nature of the rural economy and the importance of farms varies, and we know that in Northern Ireland farm sizes are smaller. The livestock sector is significantly more important, and therefore in shaping policies we want to make sure that every farm business can enjoy a more productive future.
Okay, and just the very, very last point, the the powers to the devolved nations, to the assemblies. There will be flexibility there to allow certain changes. If there was a suckler herd scheme wanted to be brought in Northern Ireland, they could do that according to the
the important thing to bear in mind, so this is most of the powers in the bill are for England, but there's Schedule 4 addresses Northern Ireland, and what DARA told us is that because they don't have a political administration at the moment, they don't feel it's appropriate for them to set out a longer-term vision or put in place that legislation. And so what they've asked for is broadly speaking, a bridged version of the bill. So they want to bring across some of Part 2, which is effectively the power to roll over the existing scheme, but improve it. So the power to modify it. So switching off some of the unnecessary administration and getting rid of some of the things like the three-crop rule, where that gets in the way, for instance, they would have those powers. But they wouldn't have the power to design a new scheme outside of the retained scheme at the moment.
That's okay. Thank you.
Very quickly, George, when do you see the three-crop rule disappearing then?
Well, the bill makes provision for us to be able to remove it if we wanted to from 2020. We haven't made that final decision yet, but it creates that power to do it. The problem with the three-crop rule, the idea of incentivising better crop rotation is a good one.
Yeah.
And we want to support that, indeed, the future policy.
But it wants to be much more flexible, doesn't it?
Well, it's just the way it's done is, as often the case with EU regulations, completely dysfunctional. So you can grow a cabbage and then a cauliflower, and they're treated as separate crops, even though they're brassicas, so it doesn't really add anything to your... and you can grow winter wheat and then spring wheat.
So the short answer is you're considering it for 20, but you haven't made that...
We haven't made that decision, but there's an option and a power in there to do it.
Caroline, a quick supplementary, please. Angela, a quick supplementary, and then Caroline.
I mean, George made the point that we can't or shouldn't divorce food production and environmental standards or improvements on farms, and I agree. I think most of the committee would probably agree with that. So would both of you ministers, be ready, willing to look favourably on an amendment which presumably would put into Part 1 of the bill as a principle of the scheme an aspiration for each individual farm business to make that balance, to get that balance right, and that's what the scheme is designed to help deliver?
Well, I'm not sure what sort of amendment that would be, because we've obviously we're developing our environmental land management schemes. We're setting out what that would be.
But as a principle, I'm not talking about the detail. As a principle, surely it should be enshrined on the face of the bill.
Well, I think it is, because it is all about managing the very first clause, subsection 1A, managing land or water in a way that protects and improves the environment. So this is all about the farmed landscape. The word farmland is regularly used. It's all about the way we manage farmland.
But it doesn't mention the balance. I mean, I think farmers would be reassured if the commitment to balance were to be enshrined in the bill. I think there is a balance, and I agree with you entirely, but there is a real concern out there on the part of farmers that the bill will lead to an imbalance, and that food production levels will go down.
Well, we've been very clear throughout that what we're trying to incentivise here is a different sort of farming, an approach to more sustainable farming, not necessarily just taking land out of production and not farming. So it is...
but it's only inherent. I mean, it would be good to have the principle enshrined in the legislation.
What effect would it have?
The farmers that I speak to are concerned that that the bill will lead to a very heavy emphasis on environmental outcomes at the expense of food production. I think that's it in a nutshell. So the bill needs to provide reassurance that will not happen.
It's reassurance, isn't it, Angela? Really?
Well, I quite understand the concern. I don't understand how the amendment would
because
work.
it wouldn't put limits on the degree to which environmental outcomes are sought in any particular agreement with a farmer, but it would give reassurance to a farmer that food production standards would not be significantly cut or reduced in any way by any environmental scheme.
What would be an example of that happening?
I'm not going to give you an example.
All right,
I'm just
well,
asking you about the principle.
we'll look
You're
at that.
clearly
And
not.
come
No.
on
I'm
Yeah.
completely. We're completely open to any amendments.
Yeah.
I'm completely open to
I mean,
the
I'll give
arguments.
you
but
an example. Would
please.
be, for instance, taking sheep off the hills in my constituency, which would put them out of business potentially.
And why would that?
I mean, they do at the moment, and I agree with there is a balance there exactly about taking some sheep off the hills because we do have overgrazing, but there is a risk here that could be taken even further and could actually put some farms out of business.
What provision in the bill would lead to such an outcome?
It's not that there is any provision in the bill, it's just that the bill does not have the safeguard in it.
Okay,
How would such an amendment
we can have this debate all afternoon or all morning, but we'll get to the afternoon, I think, very quickly. My idea of 5 minutes a question has just gone to 10. I'm just aware that you will want to go in the minute, and I want to get through the rest of the questions. George, very quickly, please, and then Caroline, where we will
are
try and
debating
stick
just
to 5
these
minutes.
issues. So there were amendment, and Kerry McCarthy, I know she's on the committee. We had debates around farming systems, things such as organic and pasture-based systems and agroecological systems, and I'm able to give that reassurance through that debate, which is obviously recorded on Hansard, about the nature of the schemes that we're looking at. So I think through the process of the committee stage and various stages of debate on this, we will be able to reassure farmers about our intentions and the detail of the schemes.
Right, we'd better park that one there. Now, Caroline, we're going to try and stick to 5 minutes now. Off you go. Question number 5.
Thank you. I guess the question is, if you want to incentivise farmers to grow more trees or more flowers or create meadows or whatever, then you have to offer them money beyond what they would necessarily get for growing food in that area. And so then you've disincentivised food production, and it's how you strike the balance that you're offering enough to incentivise them to do the environmental scheme without so much that you disincentivize food production. I guess that's the question.
Are you going to get to the question or what?
Okay, okay, we're not going to answer that question. So when you're doing it, you've written a letter about the food strategy, and you have a minister and you have a non-exec director producing you a food strategy. How's that going to link up with the agriculture bill? How's that going to make sure that we don't have a beautiful environment that's not growing any food at all?
Well, the point of the food strategy is to look at a huge array of issues. Agriculture bill is part of that, but only part of that. So food and drink is our biggest manufacturing sector, and performing at the moment incredibly well. But there are a wide range of related issues which we need to look at. So the market performs a million daily miracles in order to get the food that we enjoy onto our plates. But we want to look, for example, at the impact that new technology might have on food production in the future, and what we as a government can do in order to make sure that that technology is disseminated in a way that helps to improve food production in the future. We want to look at some of the challenges to food security overall, with a significant growth in the global population, with a stress on natural resources in other countries as well. To what extent can the UK play a part in feeding the world, and to what extent are there challenges to our own food security? We also want to look at some of the related public health issues. So we know that we're the first generation that is more likely to die as a result of what we eat rather than a communicable disease that we catch. So we want to look at how we can help support public health as part of the broader challenge that we face in the future. And it comes back to the point that George made earlier. The agriculture bill is there to explain how we can provide new systems of funding to replace cap funding for, so that we can allocate public money for public good and public money for productivity investment. And it also outlines how we can intervene in the market in order to make sure that food producers get a price. But the agriculture bill isn't everything that we're doing in the sphere of agriculture and food. And the food strategy will also look at some of the other tools that government has, which are there designed to ensure that we can have the right food economy in the future.
Okay, so you spelled out how serious this is, that we're more likely to die from what we've eaten. We have an obesity crisis. We particularly worryingly have a crisis in the number of children that are growing up, and we're already obese by the time they start school. What can you do in terms of food production and incentivise the way that food is processed and produced that will improve that? And therefore, why wasn't that in the agriculture bill, so you can offer financial incentives to do that? Or will there be more money available?
Well, part of the point of the food strategy is to ask precisely those questions. And that will inform both the support that DEFRA provides, but it will also inform policy more widely. And I think one of the questions about obesity and childhood obesity is that it is a big and growing problem, a big public health problem. And there are some things that we do know, but there are other areas which are open to question about how we can deal with it. So we know that in crude terms, obesity tends to be concentrated amongst certain groups, often people who face particular socioeconomic limits and stresses, and we want to better understand what we can do in order to help there. But one thing that I have said I'm happy to underline, and is very much at the forefront of our mind, is that all the ingredients of a healthy diet are, or almost all of them, citrus excepted, are grown in the UK and provided to a higher quality and in a more environmentally friendly way by British farmers than by anyone else. So supporting British farms is critical to that.
So isn't that really why this work on food should have been done before the agriculture bill, so that when you're producing the public goods for the agriculture bill, this could have been included?
Well, I think that's an absolutely fair challenge. I would say that what the agricultural bill does, and again, it provides a framework for us to ensure that we can support public goods and can support future food production. But the world is always changing, and there's always going to be a tension between the desire to have legislation that can provide certainty in the future and the capacity for any government or parliament to react to changes which are potentially promising but bring challenges. So we know that vertical farming technology, hydroponics and so on, is likely, though not inevitable, to be a bigger part of food production in the future. And I would suspect that when it comes to the regulation of vertical farming, we may well, DEFRA may well, and others may well bring in legislation and regulational support for that in the future. But in the meantime, we've got to, taking account of our decision to leave the European Union, put in place a system in order to ensure that we can work with farmers in order to develop the schemes that can give them an opportunity to succeed in the future. So the agricultural bill is critically important to make sure that we have a system in place as we leave the EU to support farmers and food production, but it's not the end of the story for what DEFRA or any government might do in this area.
So just to clarify, you said that the farming support financial package will remain the same numerically, and you've produced the agriculture bill, which gives you lots of powers to do everything except for necessarily support some of these things that might come out of your food strategy. So if, when you do your food strategy, you identify areas in which you actually could need to use financial incentive, where will the money come from? Can you take it out of your envelope that you've already said will go to farming support, or will there need to be new money from the Treasury?
Well, I can't anticipate what the food strategy by definition will recommend, but some of the things that it might recommend will be in the area of public health, and some of the things that it might recommend might be areas where I might want to cooperate with Matt Hancock, or my successor might want to cooperate with Matt Hancock in order to achieve particular outcomes. But by definition, if the strategy makes a compelling recommendation for additional investment in particular areas, then the government would take that seriously.
Okay. I might just add as well that there are elements then of Clause 1, Subsection 1 that actually do have overlap with public health. So if we were to pursue options such as integrated pest management and reduced pesticides, if that was that's a public good that can already be covered by 1A. If we were to pursue livestock systems that required less antibiotics, which undoubtedly then has a knock-on impact on our critically important antibiotics in public health, that would be covered by the work on animal health and animal welfare. So there is a lot of overlap with some of the powers already set out in Clause 1.
Okay, can we leave it there? There used to be a Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. I know it was in the ancient history, but food and agriculture are so linked. And I think, I like your letter that we received this morning on Food, Secretary of State, and you talked there about affordable food. And I think that's an issue for me, is that the whole agriculture bill doesn't really talk about how you're going to keep the potential to produce food. And if you're going to have affordable food, you're going to need a quantity of food. And I think that, unless are you going to import in order to make it affordable? Because if you don't, and if you do that, you then destroy our own prices, you see. So how do you get this affordable bit? It's a great word, and I think all our population want to be able to feed itself and eat. But we do need to have a good scale production. Have you given that any thought or not?
Yes, well, one of the reasons that food occupies a smaller percentage of household income overall, though we have to acknowledge that there are, and I would never shy away from this, that there are people in this country who face severe economic pressure, but as a general rule, we spend less of our disposable income on food, and that's as a result of the energy and enterprise of our farmers and also technological breakthroughs that have increased productivity and yield. There is an argument, if I were an economist, whereby I would say that if you asked a taxpayer, should I tax you more in order to pay for a food producer to then produce food that's cheaper, that economist might say, well, actually, why do I need to pay the producer in order to lower the price? Because I'm losing some of my own disposable income through tax in the first place. And there's a broader question about whether or not BPS, as currently designed, has actually driven innovation in and of itself. So I think our farmers are innovative and productive, but there is an argument that BPS has held back productivity and investment in making sure that we have
I
more
think it's been
businesses.
mixed, Secretary of State. I think some places it has, other places farmers have used that support in order to maintain production as well. So I think it's a mixed blessing, BPS. I'd be the first to say that. But I think it's too purist to say it's been a detrimental, because lots of farmers in my constituency have used their basic farm payment to keep them producing food and keep that livestock on the hill. So I think that's why we've got to have smart ways of replacing that. I
quite agree, but one of the things that, again, economists would point out is that some of those areas in farming that have been least subsidised have been most profitable and productive.
Certainly pigs and poultry are an example of that. Yes, can I pass on to Alan now, because the trouble is I'm not fulfilling my own thing of keeping people to time by intervening. Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Neil. If we look at fair dealing with agricultural producers, obviously, like the NFU, have welcomed the powers to impose obligations for purchasers of agricultural products. So it's a principle there that people agree with. But why have fair dealing obligations in this bill when they've also got the Groceries Code Educator rather than a system that actually covers the entire supply chain?
That is, there's two provisions here. There's some provisions around data and information. So one of the thoughts that we've got is you could aggregate wholesale sale data from processors, for instance, and make that publicly available so that farmers have got the tools they need to be able to challenge processors when they're not getting the right price, rather than it being a lack of transparency and oblique and them not really having the tools they need to be able to challenge prices. And then there's a second section which is around fair dealing and requiring the first purchasers of agricultural produce to have a power for us to be able to require certain terms and conditions on statutory contracts. And so we've had a problem for a long time with some dairy processors forcing farmers to commit to sell them all of their production, but frankly giving them no real transparency or no adequate transparency about how that price would be calculated. And we've attempted various voluntary codes, but the problem always with voluntary codes is that the good people take part and those who you have most problem with don't. And then eventually it starts to disintegrate because the good people say they're putting themselves at a disadvantage. So we've taken the view that in these areas, rather than say there's a problem with profitability on farming, let's throw subsidy at it, let's actually tackle some of the causes of that poor profitability. And one of them is the weakness of farmers in the supply chain at the moment, and that's what these powers do.
Yeah, but again, the question is dealing with why not have a single system that encompasses the whole supply chain Now, when we've took evidence, each stakeholder was actually scathing at the concept of the Rural Payments Agency being the body responsible for overlooking fair dealing. Absolutely scathing. So why does the UK government think it should be RPA and not the Groceries Code Educator, who everybody's actually agreed is an exemplar regulator? So why not enhance powers for the Groceries Code Educator?
So the first thing, just on the GCA, there are 7 people there, and it has a very narrow remit with 10 major supermarkets, and it is funded by a levy on the supermarkets. So if farmers are saying they would like the GCA to do it and they wanted that to be upscaled, well then the implication of that is there would be a tax and a levy on farmers in order to pay for that. So the model has been set up specifically to do supermarkets, and it works well for them.
Levies.
Yes, but then let me just come on
why
to
not
the...
spend some of that on getting the market right?
There's a review, separate review on the HGB.
Frittering it all away.
Sorry, the second point on the RPA. Let me just look. The RPA obviously will have some reputational flack because of the difficulties of administering a dysfunctional EU scheme that it has to do. But the RPA also has a lot of expertise in many areas. It implements a school milk scheme for the EU. It also runs carcass classification in all of our abattoirs. So if you're going to have new requirements on carcass classification, new requirements on abattoirs, the RPA already have people there. They're best placed to do that. The GCA don't. And the RPA also administers lots of other schemes as well in this space. So it doesn't just administer the rural payments, although that's its main function. It does also have knowledge and expertise existing in these areas.
But looking at fair dealing is still going to be additional responsibilities and still going to be additional skills. And although you said the GCA is funded by 11 supermarkets, so if it was a GCA enhanced, the farmers need to pay a levy, but presumably the government is going to have to provide extra funding for an expanded RPA to deal with this. So arguably the government could do the same thing for the Groceries Code Educator, surely.
It's a question of badging. I mean, we suggested it would be the RPA just because they're best placed to do some of this work, particularly things like carcass classification. They're doing this sort of thing already. And the GCA, Christine Tacon, as you know, has been very clear that she thinks the success of their model is that it's got a very narrow remit and is built around improving a relationship with those 10 major supermarkets.
And is it her reluctance to expand that's driving government policy then?
No, our view is that the RPA are already doing this work, so they're best placed to take it on, and that the GCA is a successful model that we shouldn't ruin by throwing too many other additional responsibilities on it.
I'll just change tack slightly. So clause 25, you'll be aware the Scottish Government is taking legal advice, and I believe a legislative consent motion is required, and it's also required for clause 26. So where does the UK government sit at the moment in terms of resolving these issues and working to get agreement for a legislative consent motion?
Well, we're at official level and at ministerial level in conversation with Fergus Ewing and with the Scottish Government in order to try to come to a common understanding and an agreement so that if a legislative consent motion is required, that it can be passed. And I should say that, as I've said to this committee before, Fergus takes a very constructive and pragmatic approach. Of course, he has to be guided by the legal advice that he receives from the Scottish Government's legal advisors, but we believe that there can be a constructive way forward.
And you know then FUS have sought legal advice as well about clause 26 and the possible impact, and their legal advice does say that would be the UK government as it stands legislating and devolve compensating, possibly undermining support that can be given to farmers in Scotland.
I'm familiar with the argument. I think there may be a misunderstanding in the case that's being made.
Their legal advice, there's an understanding. Their legal advice and Scottish Government's legal advice.
I think there may be a misunderstanding, but obviously we're having a constructive conversation with those concerned.
Well, that's independent legal advice. I mean, in terms of these discussions, clearly there's been amendments put down to the Bill Committee, which has gone through the process at the moment. So that I would suggest that would be an easy way to resolve the matter. To accept the amendments.
We will and are looking at the amendments. As I say, I think there may be a difference of understanding on some of these points, but we want to achieve a constructive shared understanding and shared way forward.
It's a technical issue, but it's important to understand. So the WTO schedule at the moment, and in particular the one on aggregate measures of support, that's held by the EU. And the EU have regulations that require the UK to submit the information on our schemes. And then they satisfy the WTO that the EU as a whole is compliant. And we have something called the UK Coordinating Body that is already a UK body hosted by the RPA, that great agency that you like to attack. But that is responsible for coordinating all of the data from all of the DAs and submitting it to the EU, so that the EU can then in turn submit it to the WTO. What we're trying to do in Section 26 is something very similar. It's just making sure that DAs submit to us the information that the UK would need to have in order to satisfy its obligations to the WTO. And it would be a UK schedule for AMS. So just as the EU now have to have that information to be able to satisfy it, our view is that the UK government would also have to have that information to be able to satisfy the WTO that we're compliant.
Yeah, but as it's coming back, as a power to come back, then it should be devolved as far as it can, because the existing acts compel the Scottish Government to act with international treaties anyway, so therefore it should be done in conjunction and consent of the Scottish Government. Yes,
but the point is, with AMS, where you have several components of the UK all contributing to a single envelope, the Scottish Government has no way of knowing whether it's compliant. Only the UK can know that, because it has to have oversight for the whole UK. So it's a simple, it's a very narrow technical matter.
So one last question, Alan, please.
So back to that then. So you're saying the legal advice the NFUS has got and the Scottish Government got is completely wrong, and they should just...
No, I think that there's a misunderstanding. So I think that without wanting to go into it, I think the question that may have been asked of the legal advisors might not necessarily have been what's the word? A question consistent with the interpretation of the legislation that George has just provided.
Okay, I'll feed that back.
Okay. Minister of State, I want you to take you up on something when you say we don't actually attack the Rural Payments Agency, that the actual reputation of the Rural Payments Agency out there is shot, to be perfectly blunt with you, with the farmers, with all of those, because cases keep coming back, they get regurgitated, there's problems year after year. So why is it that we should have confidence, and why would anybody in the industry, right, in the trade and through contracts, take any notice of the Rural Payments Agency? I mean, they are a laughing stock. And so the idea, not because of the individuals, because many of the individuals do a good job, but the general Rural Payments Agency, I mean, if you say to somebody, we will threaten you with the Rural Payments Agency, they'd probably laugh all the way to wherever. So, I mean, the grocery code adjudicator's got credibility. She's able to take people, big retailers, and threaten them, take them to court if necessary, fine them, all of these things she can do. And so why reinvent another system that won't work? It really won't, because I'm not, I'm sorry, nobody in the major retailer or anybody else is going to be frightened by the Rural Payments Agency. Come on, would you, Secretary of State, be frightened by the Rural Payments Agency?
I respect the Rural Payments Agency.
Oh, do you? Right, good. Well, I would expect you to do that because you're the Secretary of State. I'd expect you to say nothing else. But in fairness, Secretary of State, they have a lack of credibility, I think.
Well, I absolutely take your point on board, but I think that George made the case very clearly earlier, which is that the RPA has had to administer a system of payments constrained by EU law, which is inherently dysfunctional. And with the best will in the world, the Archangel Gabriel and Raphael, if they were in charge of the Rural Payments Agency and were constrained by EU law in that way, then we would recognise that their plain white raiment was stained with the compromises of EU law.
Right, well, I look forward to the future when we actually create our own policy that the Rural Payments Agency do deliver it. They don't actually make a mess up of all the maps, the forms, everything else, and they change from year to year the farmland that the same farmers are farming, and then they change it every time. And there's just a litigation of problems. So let's...
There have been problems. I would say two things. The first is that some of those problems arose because of decisions to have Natural England administer some of these payments. And I would say that Paul Caldwell, who's currently running the Rural Payments Agency, as members of this committee will know, is an exemplary public servant, and he and his team have been making significant improvements. There's a lot more to do. But I think it's important for me to place on the record my gratitude to him for his leadership.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. Just very quickly on, we had Arla in, and of course Arla on milk contracts, they prefer to have flexibility because they make a 13th payment, and so therefore they like to hold a certain amount of money back. The farmers actually own, they buy into Arla. So are you going to allow, Minister of State, any flexibility for large milk cooperatives or milk cooperatives generally?
What we will be seeking to do, and we've been considering as well whether to use some of the existing powers to set up a statutory scheme for milk dairy contracts. But all they have to be able to do is to demonstrate with absolute clarity the basis on which price is calculated.
Right.
And so I know that Arla and others have raised concerns.
Well, they gave evidence,
And we can look at their specific issues. But for instance, I had a small dairy say to me recently that they have a price that's clear but that is pegged against one of the other major, so it's a percentage above what one of the other major processors offers.
So you don't think they should have too much to fear from what you're doing?
No. So I think some have overinterpreted to think that it'll have to be based on a sort of international commodity price for butter or something. That's not the case. What it will need to be, though, is absolutely clear about the method in which the price is calculated, and that's what matters.
I should say that figures which have been published while the committee is met, official statistics, are encouraging on farm income overall, and particularly so on dairy farms. Average income on dairy farms more than doubled to £119,700 per farm in the last year, driven by an average rise of 22% in the price of milk and high volumes of production. On grazing livestock farms, 36% increase for lowland and 5% for those in less favoured areas. And overall, we saw all farm businesses, apart from specialist pig businesses, recording increases. So it's important to recognise that our farmers, notwithstanding all the pressures that they face, are doing a tremendous job in running profitable businesses and providing affordable food.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there's a cyclical milk price, and we're in a better one at the moment, which is always good. But those statistics will alter with prices, world commodity prices. Just very quickly, in the bill, we talk about agricultural transitional period. We also, at what point will we review the impact of the bill on farming and the environment? And also, you're dealing with these pilot schemes, aren't you, at the moment, of land management? When are they likely to come to fruition? When are they likely to be? When are farmers and land managers likely to know what they're going to look like?
Well, we're talking now to farmers and land managers who've expressed an interest in running some of those pilots, and of course, as we move out of the transition period and out of our membership of the Common Agricultural Policy, then there's an opportunity for us to demonstrate to the committee and to others the potential of these schemes. But indeed, the purpose of the 7-year transition is in order to ensure that we can learn from some of those early pilots and then develop schemes that more and more people will feel.
And are we going to have an opportunity, because I think this is actually a good role for the Select Committee to be able to look at these schemes and how they would be rolled out and how they... are we going to have an opportunity to be able to look at them and properly put some ideas down? Because I think we can also take ideas and feed them in, but we would like that sort of genuine time to do it.
Well, absolutely. And one example of that, which I'm grateful to you for, was the opportunity to visit Exmoor and to talk to the team there about their ambition to take advantage of the provisions in the Agriculture Bill. And there are a number of organisations from the RSPB and Nature Friendly Farming Network to individual farmers who I've had the opportunity to meet in this job who are mustard keen to help us to develop these new schemes.
Okay. Can I quickly ask Angela, can you just do quickly question number 8 and then we better let you go. Yeah.
Right. I just want to ask about funding for the schemes. Now, it's been made clear the NFU is proposing amending Clause 33 of the bill to allow for a multi-annual budgetary framework that provides certainty for farmers. Do you accept that the farming sector does need long-term certainty?
The more certainty
in order to plan and invest?
The more everyone would like the maximum amount of certainty in order to have the opportunity to plan and invest. But indeed, as the chairman pointed out, one of the things that we have to face is that food producers are dealing in or with a market situation. There will be market fluctuations. So, of course, we would want to give people the maximum amount of certainty. consistent with other budgetary discipline requirements.
So, multi-annual budgets?
Well, we'd like to give them the maximum amount of certainty, but I think multi-annual budgets would be a matter for the Treasury to reflect on as we go into the spending review.
Now, in terms of the global funding, John asked this question earlier. The current level of funding is 3.4 billion. It would give farmers a huge sense of reassurance if you were to commit now to maintaining that level of funding. It's a very small proportion of UK net public spending expenditure. Surely, in the interests of certainty in a very, very volatile situation, it would be incredibly helpful to send out that message now that at least the proportion of 3.4 billion would be guaranteed.
I quite understand, but I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Okay, now you made quite, sort of negative comments earlier about the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, but already Commissioner Hogan has laid down on the table, made absolutely clear what the financial picture will look like. It's going to be a 5% cut from 2020 onwards. So all farmers know that, but the Commissioner is also consulting on a reform of CAP, very similar to the reforms that you're suggesting, Secretary of State.
Indeed.
In which the 80% that goes to 20% of EU farms will be altered in order to mitigate the impacts of the 5% cut on smaller farms. So the point you made earlier that farmers do not have certainty under CAP is not really very fair, is it? So we face a situation in which farmers in the UK have a greater sense of certainty under CAP than they will do under your scheme.
Well, Commissioner Hogan, whom I have an enormous amount of respect for, I think is moving policy in the right direction.
Yes.
But it certainly hasn't been agreed.
No, it's not agreed, but it's
Indeed.
put the budget cut on the table. There is a level of certainty there. Surely you need to match that, Secretary of State.
No, I think that one of the things that Commissioner Hogan has a proposal that he's put forward. Again, I admire him and I admire the arguments that he makes, but it is very far from having been agreed. So simply because a Commissioner puts forward a proposal, that doesn't mean that that's going to occur, because the individual member states take very, very different views on what the shape of that budget should be. So it's very far from having been decided.
Shape of the budget, but the 5% cut is on the table. Now,
it is on the table,
are we looking? Okay,
but
so
it hasn't been agreed.
Let's try another tack. Are we looking at a cut in the 3.4 billion, the proportion that goes to farmers? Are we looking at an increase? Are we looking at a commitment to real terms increases?
We have a commitment to preserve that funding right up until 2022.
And you'll make no commitment beyond that. I don't think increasingly farmers and their representative bodies are deeply unhappy at the lack of a commitment, given that they're being taken out of a system that does give them a degree of certainty.
It is a matter of fact that the farming sector has a greater guarantee of funding in the United Kingdom than in any other EU country.
Right, let's leave that there. Caroline, one sentence.
One sentence. If we have an extension to the transition period, what will happen to these schemes and the funding? Well, particularly if it's a short one and it only applies to half a year, how will that impact on farmers and farming subsidies?
An extension to the overall transition period, the IP, for as we leave the European Union.
Yes. Because we could end up being halfway through a year, couldn't we?
Right.
Yeah.
It shouldn't have any necessary impact on what we propose to do and the changes that we propose to make, but one of the things that we're very anxious to do at DEFRA is to avoid the necessity of such an extension.
Okay.
Just before you leave, when do you expect the Agricultural Bill to receive royal assent, and when will we see consultation and statutory instruments relating to the bill? Do you know that timing?
Well, we are obviously going through it in earnest at the moment through its common stages, and it'll go to the House of Lords, I suspect, later this year, possibly early in the new year, but the aim is to get, obviously, this bill with royal assent and on the statute book in time for leaving the EU.
And when do the statutory instruments start to roll into Parliament? Do they roll in sooner?
Well, there's two things. We'll be publishing, as Secretary said earlier, publishing more details about our latest thinking on the schemes, so that as the bill progresses, people will have more information about our direction of travel and the nature of some of the pilots that we're looking at, for instance. The actual SIs themselves, to give effect to some of these things around things, for instance, such as contracts and fair dealing, those won't have to happen in the short term, because it'll actually be mainly deployed during the agricultural transition period from 2021 onwards.
But what I'm saying is, does the bill have to wait to get royal assent before we actually see statutory instruments coming in to transfer powers across?
Well, I think at the moment there are quite a lot of DEFRA statutory instruments that are coming forward in order to prepare us for EU exit.
Right.
But I think what we can do is provide you, not with full draft statutory instruments, but with significantly greater detail about what we intend to do.
That would be really useful, because, and also if we could have some idea of what is going to come through in the way
Absolutely.
of statutory instruments, so that we've got at least a opportunity to see what they are.
I quite understand.
Okay. Well, thank you, Secretary of State. You've given us some extra time. Very much appreciate it. Thank you, Minister of State. We had a very good session with you. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Proceeding is currently in private. The proceeding is currently in private.